I'm working today with a really pretty yarn, but it has an issue. It tends to do this, even though I rewound it. It's one of the few yarns you can get at a craft store that is indeed the perfect weight for standard gauge machines. And it makes a gorgeous fabric. So I am working through the issue, trying to find the best way to wind it, and I will cover all that in another video because I'm designing a tank top that I think you'll enjoy out of this yarn. I'm working on my Corona 1500 and it handles the yarn really well. It does not handle these knots really well. When I fail to catch one, it dumps some work off of the machine, making a terrible mess. So this video is about how to go about fixing things like this on a Corona because it's a little bit different from some other machine. Before I go into fixing that mess, let me show you something about how you might have less of it occur. Notice how neatly the needles are forming a straight line after I knit now. This is a recent improvement. Prior to this, my needles were loose and jiggly, and while the machine knitted very well, I think that the looseness occasionally caused some mispatterning and jams, and things dropped off the machine. So the yarn is a difficult one, but it's not totally, utterly to blame. And it may be a good idea for you to look at the video on how I managed to make this stop and try to make yours stop jiggling around as well. Once the needles are nice and firm in their position, bracing, as I'm about to show you, might become unnecessary. First, you want to find something to brace the needles in the all the way forward position. I just went rummaging in my craft room and found this cedar drawer sachet. It's really just a piece of wood that happens to fit. And this piece of wood that had been used as a brace and removed and was still sitting around. The screw has nothing to do with this project, but it was still present and it's not hurting anything. One could press almost anything into surface, including cardboard pieces cut to fit. The point is that the needles cannot move backwards and dump stitches with these items bracing the needle butts. Most of us with Coronas have needed to replace the items that were originally inside that performed functions similar to those of a sponge bar. Many Corona knitters, including myself, have never actually knitted on a Corona when it had the correct movement dampening material in position. So we're not positive exactly how they would have knitted when new. But at present, the needles tend to wiggle around a little bit more than those of Brothers or Singer Studio Silver Reed machines, if you're familiar with them. And that renders it an issue when trying to capture dropped stitches and reknit them as I'm doing here and rehang them, because neighboring stitches are easy to nudge right off of the needle due to looseness and lack of gate pegs. So what I've done here is isolated the most problematic area. To the left of where I'm working, I was able to simply unknit the row in the ordinary way. That work did not drop. To the right of the isolated area, it did drop, but it didn't run and make a mess, as it did right where the knot occurred. So I was able to rehang that successfully. At present, the two cedar blocks are controlling the needles near them so that those needles cannot ditch stitches, and I can manipulate the mess in between, which is only about a dozen needles. It takes a combination of techniques to fix a mess like this one. Any stitch that has not run can simply be rehung on the correct needle, and you do have to be careful about that. These two stitches had run and left some floats in between other needles that were okay, and they need to be reknitted all the way across with that long loop of yarn to the right. But now they're ready. This is one of the stitches that was simply rehung, and it looks to me like it's twisted, so I'm going to twist it to the correct position and rehang it again. Once it's rehung, it's grown, so I'm pulling down there to even up the stitches in that area and then moving the block over so that they now have to behave themselves while I move on to the real run in the garment. To fix that run, the latch tool needs to go behind the fabric, grab the last good stitch, and latch up the ladder one rung at a time. You must work to keep it in order or it'll look like a tucked stitch. Well, in fact, it'll be a tucked stitch. It's awkward. Your wrist isn't actually attached to your arm in a way that makes this fun. So just resign yourself to going slowly because we're trying to save a garment that's halfway knitted. And you may find, as I often do, that up to about here, the latch tool is the best choice. Then it becomes very, very awkward. And for the last 2 or 3 rungs, it may work better to hang the existing stitch, the one that you've most recently perfected, on a needle and use the needle to manually repair the last 2 or 3 rungs of the ladder. Most of the time, an eyelet tool is easier to use to rehang the stitch than holding the latch needle backwards. But you can get them on there and then reknit them, and sometimes we can even reknit them 2 at a time, which helps them to stay a little bit more even. For right now, I want to leave that float free and rehang that final stitch. And oh drat, I thought it was 1, but in fact it's 2 stitches. I can hang that one, and then I'm going to have to stick the latch tool down there to grab the second one, latch it back up because it has also run, and then we can proceed. Sometimes the thumb of the hand that is not holding the tool can be used to manipulate the fabric a little bit and make it easier to catch only the rung that you do want. You may also use your thumbnail to flick the latch back in some circumstances when it doesn't really want to go. Now the run is recovered enough that I can hang the stitch front-ways onto the needle. It's easier to stay away from the floats this way, and then manually reknit all of the stitches that need to use those long floats in their creation. Try to envision how much yarn the machine places into each stitch. Place the float in the hook, pull back the needle, and it is going to feel quite different on a Corona to pull back the needle and create a stitch than it does on other machines. And there you see what I mean about sometimes 2 at a time knit well. They do. If we did not have the needles braced to left and to right, certainly my manipulations would be pushing them in ways that we don't want to happen, and the risk of dropping material that I've just rehung on the machine is very real. As it is, this is still a pain in the neck, and if I were not into the garment as far as I am and wanting to preserve the yarn without undue wear and tear, I wouldn't bother with it. But as you can see, it is doable. It's also possible to use the prong on your tool to adjust the stitch size somewhat even after they've been knitted. Now I have one long float that needs to knit all the way to the right and be used up to finish out this row. Doing so just requires the manual formation of stitches in the normal way. You do need to try to estimate the size the machine was making and even them up as you work. And after they're knitted, a little bit of adjustment is possible, but if you should get it totally, utterly wrong, you'll have to undo it and redo it again. Therefore, it's always a judgment call as to whether doing this is the better idea or simply unknitting another row is a better idea. I opted to do this on this occasion, partly because it truly seemed like the better idea, and partly because I wanted to show you that it's possible. As I work, I keep nudging this block along so that I can move the few needles I need to restitch, and the ones that I've just done don't take notions and jump off. As it turned out in this case, I did manage to get everything rehung and ran out of yarn at exactly the right moment. Well, here another darn knot got me, but I was able to catch it before it tried to knit through and dumped work, which it would have dumped about here. So now I'm able to show you what you can do if you have a semi-disaster. Stop knitting and remove the carriage, which on the Corona tilts up very, very easily, and move the carriage across to the nearest side. Now the working yarn stopped knitting here, and we need to finish this part of the row. Set both side levers to number 1 so they'll hold the stitches that are all the way forward. Make sure that the yarn tail comes up between the last stitch that knitted and the first stitch that needs to knit, and leave it threaded in the carriage. Then move the carriage across the held needles until it's over an area that already did knit. Now nudge the needles that need to knit back into working position. Make sure there's no slack in the working yarn. It can develop when we're moving across held needles, and very carefully knit the remainder of the row. Now we can move the side lever to number 2 and knit normally.